Okay, this is going to be a part 3 of the pastor's paradigm. And this is a pastoral leadership training class that we put together. We did this a couple years ago, and we've kind of been just like nursing it for the last 2 years, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think we just forgot.
I don't know if we forgot. I think it's just,
I did.
you're like, I did.
You forgot, yeah.
That's a good admission, Peter.
Yeah.
And so we're going to get into it now, and we're going to pick up where we left off. And so for those that are watching part 1, part 2, this is going to be part 3, and it'll just be kind of a nice, seamless transition. So we're talking about how people matter in the church and why it matters, the way we share from the pulpit. And so there are 2 ways people learn in the church. And one of them is the things that are shared, and the other way is the things that are not shared. So do you want to elaborate a little bit on those 2 points of how people learn in a church environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So the church is obviously designed, and we've talked about this, is designed to be a community of believers, right? A place almost like a mini city, if you want to put it that way, like an actual city that people come to with the shared values and understanding of Christ. And because of that, all communities and all societies and cultures develop what would be called their taboos, like the things that are just off topic, mainly through just not talking about them. So if you want to establish a taboo, it's not going to be something that you're going to discuss a lot, because actually the more you discuss it, the more people will assume, well, it must not be that taboo. So for instance, incest, like how often do people talk about incest in modern day culture? Not a lot, and one of the main reasons is because there's just a firm, this is wrong, and then no one really discusses it. The more people discuss it, the more you would feel as if society is trying to push towards accepting it or making it less taboo or less egregious of a behavior or a sin. So the same thing is true in the church community. The pastor, as they discuss the scriptures, as they go through things, they're setting the tone for what topics are okay, allowed, and acceptable, and which topics are not, and they mainly do it through the pulpit. They do it through their teaching practices. So if they bring up particular topics, it makes the other people in the church feel comfortable. They say, okay, these kinds of topics are acceptable within the church. These are the things that we're going to discuss and talk about and not fear any kind of repercussion or shame. But if things are just not talked about at all, and if you add on top of that, whenever the topic is brought up in any amount, it's always just one line, this is wrong, or this is sinful, or this is bad. It is establishing a taboo. It's telling people this is not something that we talk about in church. This is not something we discuss. So you don't have to say that from the pulpit. And many pastors that I've spoken to over the years, many pastors that Bo has spoken to over the years, they'll say things like, well, we talk about sexual issues. And what they mean by that is that every now and then they'll blast pornography, or they'll blast premarital sex, or maybe homosexuality or something like that. But what they don't mean is that they actually bring up topics of sexuality in positive ways and discuss, well, what kind of sexuality is positive? What kind of sexuality is something that God would desire for his people? What does that look like? What does that not look like, right? This kind of intentional, specific dialogue is what gives people the comfortability to know that a topic is not off into, as I said, the taboos and misuse of society.
Yeah, and this and you just gave a great summary. It's so awesome because everybody knows kind of what's taboo already,
Right.
kind of in their mind, They already kind of have a notion of that. And the Bible speaks of sexual topics pretty regularly
Right.
if you're going through the Bible.
Right.
And so the topic of sex does come up. But then it's how it's shared, right? That you're talking about, how a pastor shares it is going to kind of tell the tale of how that church is going to be educated on these subjects, or how comfortable they're going to feel about these subjects.
Right.
So it's always funny when a pastor gets up there and they say, for instance, get to a place like Sodom and Gomorrah, or Lot having sex with his daughters, or Judah having sex with Tamar. And they'll say, like, we're really going to get into some heavy ground here. Have you heard that before?
Yeah.
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 And, or that kind of thing. And that's what we're talking about. It's the things that are shared affect the congregation.
Right.
Because when you say, oh, this is going to be heavy, and what you're doing is you're differentiating that topic
Right.
from other topics.
Right.
And that's what educates people of
Right.
like what is taboo and what is not.
Right.
And that's for instance,
Yeah.
one that I think most people that are in leadership totally understand. Oh, this one, like I don't want to really share Ezekiel 23. I don't really want to read it because
Right.
it's really graphic. Or let's
Right.
not go into Song of Solomon because it's really graphic. Well, what
Right.
does that say?
Right.
About sex to your audience that you're trying to educate,
Right.
on
Right.
the topic.
Where it is educating them, and that's the important thing, is
Right.
that it is educating them.
Right. So what is not shared is educating them too. So that's the point. It's not just what is shared, but
Right.
it's what that's not shared.
Right.
And so if a pastor doesn't go through a passage and say, hey, let's talk about what this passage is referring to. It's talking
Right.
about incest here with Lot and his daughters.
Right.
And you know what? Incest is prevalent in our world. It's something that's been prevalent in our world all throughout human history.
Right.
This is not something that's odd even to us as a congregation. Many of us have been molested, or we've gone through times of trial incestuously in our families. And, so, hey, we can relate to one another, on this level as humans. Then people go, oh, man, okay, I get it. It's like, hey, we've all gone through a lot of this stuff.
Right.
And, and you feel much more like, kind of like this isn't a taboo topic anymore.
Right.
This is something I could bring up. Like if I go up for prayer, or if I want to talk to a counselor, I know I can talk about this subject in a relatively safe environment because the leader just did.
Right.
Right? So, Peter, what kind of behavioral conditioning do you think happens?
The big ones are, as a counselor, when I see people, let's start with my premarital load. So when I see various people for premarital counseling, they're about to be married. I'm walking them through Matthew 19. I'm walking them through the aspects of what a God-glorifying marriage looks like, and I'm trying to get into all the nuances of it and give them conversation starters, basically. Things that I want them to leave with so that they're talking about it together, and it's things that are going to stick with them through the course of their marriage, things that they're going to be working through as their marriage goes. And one of the topics we discuss is sex. And me and you talked about this one or two podcasts ago, that it's very rare nowadays that I encounter a couple that aren't having sex in their premarital state. So they're engaged, but they're having sex, they're living together. That's really, really common nowadays. Now, one of the things that's really surprising to me when I discuss with them sexual things, and I go through biblically all the passages that speak about sex, all the passages that speak about sexuality, and I ask them, have you ever heard this before in church circles? And they'll always say no. I've never heard anyone say, oh yeah, I've heard that. I've never heard anyone say that. They're like, no, I never heard that. Right? I've never heard that discussed.
And it's weird when someone's like been in the church for 30 years,
right?
And they're sitting down with you, and you're like, you never heard that,
right? And some of these people, by the way, this is their second marriage. This is their third marriage. It's not like they're spring chickens. They're in their 50s,
pros,
60s.
Man.
Yeah, they've been having sex. They got kids. They've been in the church forever, and they just never heard it. And that makes me push them a little bit. And we do this in Salvation Army as well, where I'm like, well, if you're not seeing your sexuality from a biblical perspective, what perspective are you looking at it from? Where are you learning your ideals about sex and sexuality? And after a little bit, if I talk to people, especially younger people, they'll admit, well, I'm getting most of my experience and understanding from friends, from just experimentation with my partner, through pornography, a lot of them, things like that. This is their education that they're receiving. They're thinking about sex through the lens that the culture is giving them. That's how they're understanding it. And with the younger couples, honestly, I'm like, okay, that's not the worst thing. I'm going to have to push you guys a little bit to help you understand the biblical perspective, but at least from their minds, sex is pleasurable, sex is good. They're thinking through like, okay, what does feel good for my partner, and they're very open about discussing their sexuality because that's the culture we live in. So I'm like, okay, that's good, and I'll tell you why I think it's good in a second here. But it's good, but you need to push it a little further and say, like, are you discussing God in the terms of the bedroom? Like when you're talking about what is okay in the bedroom, what's not okay in the bedroom, do you ever think about God? Or do you ever think like after intimacy or during intimacy, do you ever think like, man, like God is so good to put this into my life, to give me this person, that we have this amazing and beautiful activity that we get to do with one another, that and it feels amazing and it has the potential to create life. Like do those ideas ever go through your head? And of course they would say no, because God is absent from the bedroom in their mind. So that's bad, but it's much better than what I get from older couples.
Yeah, so let me stop you before you go to the older couples. So
Yeah.
the first point that I get is that one of the behavioral issues is that God is separated from sex. So if
Right.
I'm not able to communicate properly the word of God on these issues in a very comfortable way,
Yeah.
then I will make people assume that there's a taboo around this
Right.
topic, to the point where sex becomes secular.
Right.
Sex is harlotry, pleasure is harlotry. It's all prostitution, if you're not procreating or you're just doing it for your duty,
Right.
Kind of thing. So that's one aspect, is you detach God from the issue of sex.
Right. And so, like I said, the younger couples, because we have such a sex positive culture, and when I say it's sex positive, what I mean is that we have a culture that believes that sexual autonomy is one of the greatest goods that you can enjoy. And again, there's some benefits to that and there's some negatives to that, where even though there's a high sex positive message, there isn't any boundary messages. There isn't any sex is really good, but here are boundaries around it so that it doesn't end up becoming a destructive force within your
Probably
life.
the biggest one is the one of where you agree. We
Right.
agree to have sex. What is it called? You get consent.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's probably the biggest boundary
Absolutely.
in education.
Absolutely. And so, when I'm talking to these young couples, because they haven't incorporated God into the bedroom, there's a little bit of a hurdle that they got to get over once they get into marriage. Because unfortunately, and this is something that's really played out in statistics, a lot of couples, when they get married, their sex lives go down. And the reason why their sex lives go down is because it's the tension and the kind of uncertainty that's actually producing the passion within the bedroom, which sounds kind of weird, but that's how some people, they don't think about it consciously, but it is subconscious. Where in other words, my sexual performance, especially for women, is being propounded by the idea of, I am afraid that if my sexual chemistry with this person isn't really, really great, they won't marry me. They eventually won't marry me. Once you diffuse that and someone gets married, then sexuality tends to go away, because now they don't feel that pressure. They don't feel like, oh, I need to put out because, if I don't, then they might find someone better or something like that. They instead are just like, oh, okay, like we're married, we're good. And then for the man, because he now feels like he's confined to this one person, his pleasure in it can start going away. So unless someone has a framework to understanding the committed nature of God's love and how that produces a passion that's very different than the uncommitted passion that occurs within casual sex, if they don't have a framework for understanding that, the pleasure in sexuality can decrease very rapidly once they get married. Now, when it comes to the older couples, their view is actually even worse. So because they have this idea that God is not really pro-sex, and they came from a culture that did not have a sex positive message. If they were coming from like the hippie movement, they did. But like for
Yeah.
a lot of these people that I'm
Yeah,
counseling,
and a lot of them weren't hippies.
right, they're coming from a conservative family that's more into evangelicalism and things like that. So if I talk to an older person who's from like the hippie movement or something like that, then they're going to be like the younger couple. But for most people, like I said, they're coming from this more rigid conservative Christian background. Now for them, because God is separate from the bedroom, they look at sexuality as something to be completely ashamed of. And you even see it in older movies and things like that. There's certain older movies, like the James Bond movies, that were a little bit progressive in their depictions of
Oh
sexuality.
yeah.
But a lot of them, Leave It to Beaver and things like that, they would depict the couples sleeping in separate beds because they didn't even want people to think that these couples were having sex. So if you come from that kind of background, and sex is just something that's so taboo that it's not even spoken about in the culture, then your mindset is, I'm definitely not going to talk about it with my partner. And so there's a lot of women out there that have been taught directly, a lot of them from various ministries I'm not really going to name right now, but from various Christian ministries that tell them like, hey, sex is kind of like a guy thing. You're not really going to dig it that much, but it's something your husband needs. And if you're not providing that for him, it will cause lust in his heart and he's going to find it somewhere else. Because of that, also, a lot of men don't know much about female arousal, right? They don't know what it means for a female to be aroused or what it takes for them. They kind of assume that women are like men in the fact that they get aroused very rapidly and very quickly. And that if they're not aroused, it's very obvious. But obviously, that's not true. People who have been intimate know that female arousal is something that takes a lot more time, takes a lot more effort, and it takes a lot of focus and intimacy to be already occurring. But if that doesn't occur, then damage can actually be done to the woman. So this book was released a couple years ago called The Great Sex Rescue, in which they did a survey of this very particular vaginal injury that can happen to women, and it predominantly happens to women who are raped. So if a woman is raped, obviously her body is not ready or prepared or wanting that kind of an intimacy to occur. And so because of that, it damages that part of them. And what they found is that the statistics of women who get that injury and are raped, the statistics are really not very different than women who are married in evangelicalism that have sustained the same injury. That's horrifying to understand.
Yeah, but you could see how, that happens.
Right.
Right? You could see how that happens because there's many Christian ministries that a lot of leadership are relying on for their education of their congregation on sexual topics. So like a lot of leaders will go like, hey, I don't really know what to talk about with this topic.
Right.
And they for some reason just don't know. And so they'll rely on these different parachurch ministries and then they'll get into this, then it becomes something that grows. These parachurch organizations grow and they, have, seminars and conferences and retreats and thousands of people go to them.
Right.
And pretty soon, you have this idea that, I certainly heard in the church growing up or growing in the church. And that was, that men are visual,
Right.
Stimulated by eyesight and
Right.
that women aren't.
Right.
And now I never understood that.
Right.
And I thought it was always bogus just coming from a Southern California point of view, my point of view. But I was really blown away that the church looked at it that way.
Yeah.
That I was really surprised.
And just wrong, like the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy, which was a trilogy, made over $1 billion at the box office.
Yeah.
Men aren't going to see 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, and there's a reason why lesbianism is dominated on the internet.
Right.
And it's not by men.
Right. What a lot of people don't understand, and they misread the data, what they were referring to is the fact that women tend to like to have a more holistic view when it comes to relationships. So in other words, a man can just separate the act of sex from any type of context, watch it and be aroused and enjoy that. Most women can't. Some can, but most women can't. Most women would prefer to see a whole relationship and get aroused that way. So in
Yeah.
other words, they wouldn't want to see just like a sex scene. They would want to see a story in which sex is a part of it. So there are very popular shows right now that are quite graphic that are aimed at women. Women are
Right.
watching them.
Yeah.
Men aren't.
Right. And I tend to know that what happens is um, in the idea of sex, the culture of sex and its education, a lot of times, like the education that took place in the church that said men are visual, women
Right.
aren't. That was much closer to the sexual revolution in the United States and women's rights movements.
Hmm.
And women were still very much fighting for rights on many fronts.
Right.
Not that they're not today, but back then in the 80s,
Hmm.
it was like right up front, and women were still close. You still had women that were living
Right.
on the planet that talking about sex or thinking about sex or even talking about your pleasure
Yeah.
in sex for a woman would have been absolutely wrong.
Right.
But as now the generations have moved away from that movement back then,
Right.
that women's, the initial women's lib and sexual lib, that went on in the 60s, I think you people are starting to see more that men and women are very much alike than what we used to think.
Right.
Yeah, we our behaviors are very similar.
Right.
There is some outer differences
Right.
if we're doing a bubble, diagram thing.
Right.
There's some outer differences, but we certainly lust.
We're more alike than we are different.
That's right. We are more alike. And so, I want to get back to the idea of what kind of behavioral conditioning do you think happens?
Right.
Well, you're talking about it, right? One of them is detaching God from the idea of sex to a
Right.
congregation, right? The other one is having stereotypes
Right.
within a congregation,
Right.
where then you educate your congregation according to these stereotypes
Right.
that are learned by parachurch organizations.
Right.
And then you really don't have a biblical foundation really for what you're saying either,
Right.
which
And
is
so
kind of sad.
it's very sad because you'll talk to some women, especially older women, in these counselings, and they're absolutely convinced. They're just like, gosh, I just don't like sex. Sex is kind of like my husband's thing, and it's like, well, I bet you that you don't like sex. That's very true.
With
But
him.
but yeah, there's been a conditioning within your relationship where you just don't like it. You just, first of all, a lot of these women have trained themselves to not receive pleasure from sex. But secondly, they're experiencing it with a partner who is selfish and doesn't even know he's being selfish because he's essentially gotten the green light from various ministries telling him, like, sex is about you. It's not about your wife. It's about the way your wife looks because she doesn't have to care about the way you look. And then thirdly, it's just about your arousal and your orgasm. That's it. So this is the kind of information that they're getting that's direct, and it can really destroy them
Mm.
in a lot of various ways. And an unhappy, unfulfilled sexual component to a marriage can absolutely devastate and separate a couple.
Yeah.
A lot of people think like, no, like that's not a biblical ground for marriage, for divorce. True, it's not a biblical ground for divorce, but that level of unhappiness that perpetuates itself over decades can certainly change people's opinions of one another, and that can absolutely affect their overall relationship.
Yeah. And I just want to add that one of the behavioral conditioning that happens is just that people will come to your church and they will continually be in chains with this topic. They won't have to be like, I don't mean like they watch pornography per se or anything, but they will just be in chains in general with this topic. It will affect their life forever.
Right.
If you as a spiritual leader can't communicate well what the Bible has to say about this topic, and it will change people's view of God. too. You'll condition your congregation to think of God different. So for instance, a lot of people look at God and they look at him as more like a stoic. They look at him more as a disciplinary, as, someone who's just saying, "Hey man, pull up those bootstraps and get going." You know what I mean? Just discipline your mind, man. They think of God like that, where they don't understand God's a God who's bringing people into the desert and wanting to love them and draw them. And you won't see a God who wants to be intimate with you, not so intimate that he wants to be in you. He actually wants to come upon you.
Right.
And, he wants to live his life out through you. He wants to reproduce through you.
Right.
All these words of intimacy, you'll miss it all. You'll miss all the intimate terms that are used in the Bible because you now think of God so apart from sex, that you're in pleasure, that now God is just kind of that professor, Yeah. So the teaching pastor questions, these are ones we wanted teaching pastors to think about.
Yeah.
What are the confessions from the pulpit that you have heard? So we've talked about that before. Are they safe confessions? Why are they safe? We've mentioned that in a prior part. What makes it so difficult to be vulnerable as a pastor? So we want pastors to think about that, in their own life. What is our number one sin as human beings? So we wanted to kind of help them see something. If we had to pick one, would we want to be seen as morally strong, prideful, or as weak sexual issues to others? Which I think what we and you are trying to do is put ministers in kind of a little bit of a spot of going, hey, I'd rather probably be seen as strong.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That, and the reason why we're trying to, I think, with that question, share it with ministers is there is something in us that seems like always wants to be strong, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really difficult for us. If we admit a sexual thing, it seems like such a big deal.
Yeah.
It seems huge. And so it's easy as a pastor to look at someone and say, "Oh, you view pornography," and not look at your own issue of what you've done to your wife. Like of the stats that you just talked about with the vaginal injuries, or how you've hurt your wife in other ways in the bed. What have you shown her? How have you shown her God in that marriage bed? And those are tough ones. A lot of us want to be seen as really strong people, So sexual issues, I think if we got honest, as ministers, we really shy away from because maybe they reveal something in us, that, if we have to share something or admit to anything, we really get knocked down some pegs, And so do you think this plays a part in a teaching ministry? Meaning how we want to see ourselves? Do we think that plays a part in our teaching ministry in a church of how we want to be perceived or how we teach scripture? So we want people to discuss that. Are there pastors that you see as strong or weak? Why? So what are some examples of you think a strong pastor and weak one? So we've kind of gone over some of these things. So that ends our part, actually one of that whole series. So part 2, we have, it's called How Does Sharing Vulnerability Look? And so this is from Romans 7:15-25. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, I do. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that is in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. The good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that I practice. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ. our Lord. So, very popular passage. So, how do I share? We put down sympathize to understand and empathize to share feelings with. Now, in that, we do have a clip of you sharing a little bit from the pulpit where you give like kind of a demonstration of sharing. I'm not going to play it because people probably won't hear it too well, but in general, like you've done this many times from the pulpit, but what it kind of goes through your mind?
Yeah, yeah. So the reason why we picked out the Paul passage is because what Paul's doing is actually a good template for us. So sometimes we just kind of skip over Romans 7. Some people have made a really ludicrous understanding and interpretation of that passage to suggest that what Paul's doing is sharing a form of testimony. In other words, that Paul is sharing about sins that he used to commit way back in the day, but he doesn't do them anymore. There's obviously several problems with that. The biggest one is the fact that he's talking about covetousness. How many of us can honestly say that we don't covet anymore? We never want anything that doesn't belong to us ever.
Never.
Like that's an absolutely ludicrous perspective on Romans 7. Beyond that, I mean, obviously Paul's writing in present tense. All the verbs in that passage are all present tense. There's no reason for him to be doing that. So at any rate, when we look at it as a template, though, we have to understand he's writing a letter, a very public letter to a group of people that he doesn't know. And he is admitting a pretty large form of weakness. He's admitting that there are aspects of God's law that he does not have the capacity to fulfill. That even though he desperately wants to do it, he finds in himself a weakness that doesn't allow him to do it. And then he also says that there are good things that he desires to do, but he doesn't find in himself the strength to actually fulfill those desires. So that's a pretty large expression of vulnerability that, again, we don't really get in the church very much. What we tend to hear from the pulpit are admissions of past sin. I used to do this. I did do this. I was this kind of person. But a present tense admission of a failure to uphold the law of God or a willful trespass against the law of God are things that you don't really hear very much from the pulpit. Now, what Paul is also doing that is very relevant is he is utilizing the message that he is teaching to demonstrate a point through his own frailties. So if you read Romans 6 through 8, so Romans is kind of set up in a really interesting way where there are arguments that Paul is making and then he spends a couple chapters defending and elaborating on them. Romans 6 through 8 are essentially one section where Paul is defending and expressing a very simple point. Romans 1 through 5 is all about we are saved by grace. That is the whole of Romans 1 through 5. We are saved by grace. It is not by works. And he goes and he elaborates on that very, very strenuously. Romans 6 through 8 is, well, now that we are saved by grace, does that mean that we could live whatever kind of life we want? Does that mean we can continue to perpetuate sin because grace is going to cover it? And his argumentation is no, absolutely not. For who we present our members slaves to, that is the one that we will be enslaved to. So if I go and pursue God, then I will train my will and my passions to be more in line with God's. But if I go towards sin, I'll train my will and passions to be more in line with sin. But the false understanding that could spring from that is, oh, okay, so as long as I'm presenting myself to God, everything's going to be hunky-dory and I'm not going to fail. But Paul takes all of Romans 7 to express, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that if my desire to fulfill righteousness is present, then therefore I will necessarily do that perfectly. I'm saying the opposite, that the more I attempt to fulfill righteousness, the more I will find how frail and weak I really am. And then that gives birth to a new understanding and admission and acceptance of grace, which is what all of Romans 8 is about. So you have Paul presenting high theological facts, right? High theological perspectives from God of how things ought to be. And then he's expressing, this is how that doesn't work practically in my life. And then therefore I'm now moving towards understanding God's grace in a new way. So let me give you an example. If I am, as a pastor, am talking about deception, if I'm talking about lying, and I go through a passage like, let's say I'm teaching on the life of Jacob, and how deceptive he was in the early parts of his life. It'd be very easy for me as a pastor to stop there and just say, okay, so you see that Jacob in the beginning of his life was really deceptive, but he slowly learns how to be a more honest individual. And this is what God wants for us to do. He wants us to be honest individuals. He wants us to walk in integrity and to not deceive and manipulate those around us to get what we want. I could stop right there, and then the understanding that most people are going to get from the body is, oh, Peter doesn't deceive. Like, he doesn't manipulate ever. He's got this thing licked. And therefore, if I set my will to it, then I can do the same thing. I could depart from all types of lies and deception. Now, what I should do in that moment is instead bring that home to my life and say, yeah, this is something that Jacob did, and this is something he practiced in his life. He got marginally better at it, but he still, even towards the end of his life, he was still failing. But then I could bring it home to my life, and I could say, yeah, this in this area of deception, this is something I struggle with, especially when it comes to when I'm counseling or when I'm preaching from the pulpit. I have a tendency to present a version of myself that is more righteous than I really am. And I'm doing that because I want to manipulate people's perspectives of me, and I want people to think more highly of me than I really am.
Yeah, and that's a strong word, that idea of manipulate. I mean, a lot of us would love to think that we don't manipulate, but one thing we have to remember is just that the Bible teaches the heart of humans is desperately wicked, far above all things.
Right.
And that's something we have to realize, is that our hearts are this way. And there's one thing that you can do, and that is you should be able to understand sexual things, and you should be able to share about those things, because those are things that you've experienced in your life as a leader.
Right.
Meaning, I mean, as a human being.
Right.
But as a leader, maybe in your home or maybe in the community.
Right.
You know what it's like to fail. You know what it's like to mess up.
Right.
You know what it's like to still want to do good and be better, but you're still not there.
Right.
And none of us, I always like to talk about a spectrum. Jesus is, on the spectrum. He's at 100.
Yeah.
I always like to ask people, where do you think you are on the spectrum?
Right.
And, and hey, pastor, where do you think you are in the spectrum of being like Jesus? And, my answer is, man, I don't feel like I'm on the spectrum with Christ. There's so much that's just not there.
Yeah.
And thing is we should be able to, in our humanity, in our Adamic nature, which we do have,
right,
we should be able to understand and empathize with that part of that there is so much in us that is in contention with the righteousness of God.
Right.
And though we subject our bodies and though we bring it into submission, we don't do this perfectly. So we should be able to, take whatever we're working on as a minister, whether it's food, whether it's drink, whether it's pride, greed, those things, and move it into even the sexual area. And and we could say, hey, I mean, if you've never viewed pornography, like some pastors, well, it's good to say, hey, I've never viewed pornography, but I know what it's like to lust after things. You know, I know what it's like to, spend your money on something instead of really using it for another good purpose. Showing your failures. I think that's something that we need more of. So we're not talking about sharing as in spilling your guts. That's never what we're talking about. We've referred to that in past teachings in this Pastor's Paradigm instructional podcast. But so we don't never mean that. We never mean going up there after you got in a fight with your wife and be like, man, no, nothing like that. We mean within your Bible study. Within your Bible study, as you're talking about Jacob, as you're going through a passage of scripture, when you see their sin, you should be able to say, hey, this is in all of us. And this is in me too. That kind of idea should certainly be there.
And so what we also see from Paul is that he doesn't feel the need, like kind of what you were saying, Bo. He doesn't feel the need to be like, yeah, the other day I was hanging out with Timothy and I was super pissed off at him for doing this, and and he's like spilling all this like really specific, juicy
Yeah,
gossip.
or I walked through Greece
Right.
and I saw a bunch of naked statues.
Right.
I was lusting
And
after
I was
them.
less, yeah. It's like he could have done that, but he doesn't. He keeps it very reserved. He's
Yeah.
like, what do they need to know? They need to know that there is a frailty inside of my flesh that exists in all flesh. And therefore, again, that moves into Romans chapter 8, which is very important as well because, we as pastors talk often that the principles of teaching sermons are laid out for us in 1 Corinthians 14, the gift of prophecy. For all prophecy is given in edification, exhortation, and comfort. So if I want to bring about comfort, where does that comfort come from? Well, comfort arises in that little excerpt from Paul. It arises from the need for forgiveness that is produced by the frailties of the flesh, right? People can't really receive that comfort part of my sermon unless I have presented them a reason to be comforted, like a need for comfort from the Holy Spirit. If I'm telling people like, hey, this is something that we ought to do as Christians, and we're already doing it. You don't need to be comforted after that. You only need to be comforted when there's an expression or an exhortation towards good that people know in their hearts, I'm not really doing that. I'm not really fulfilling that in the way I know that God would want.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, well, none of us are, but this is the grace that God has given us, not just to forgive, but to also empower us to do better next time.
Yeah. So in order to comfort people from the pulpit, you have to give them a reason to be comforted.
Right.
Right. And therefore, in your messages, you're going to have to share the
Right.
failure.
Right.
And it's not just their failure, the congregate's failure,
Right.
but it's your failure.
Right.
That you're under this grace too. So our next slide is how can you be vulnerable in using this passage? So we give people a passage to work through.
Yeah.
And this passage is James 1:15. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So just that passage alone, we want pastors to look at and pick it apart, but then also how can you be vulnerable in using that passage? It talks a lot about sin and obviously this desire.
Yeah.
Right?
Which
what
a universal passage.
Yeah.
All he's talking about is sin in a very general sense, that sin begins in a particular way. It begins in the desires of the heart, and then it moves into the will and the intellect, and then from there it gives birth to death, meaning that you actually begin to act upon it. It's like if you can't relate to that passage in some way, then you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
Right? Then you're not paying attention to the frailties of your life.
Yeah, and can you bring up a vulnerable part of your world where you see this desire, you see how it gives birth to sin, how you do miss the mark of Christ, how you see that it brings forth a death, it brings forth an action that results ultimately in separation from God if it weren't for his grace and his mercy in your life.
Yeah.
It would ultimately be a transgression that brings forth death.
Right.
And can't you see that in your own life and be able to share that with someone, and share it in a general way with the public, that, I am a sinner, and there are things in my life where I see desires that lead to bad behaviors, and that I need to learn how to walk in a better way as well. So we want people to kind of use that passage and try to see if they can show a little vulnerability there with other people. And that might be tough for some people to do.
Yeah.
So is there a place in this commentary where more vulnerability potentially could help the reader? Okay, so here we have for instance, a commentary on the passage that we just read. And this says, example 1, though sin does not always cause physical death, the very nature of sin is to injure, harm, and kill. Sin results in the death of honor, respect, trust, morals, innocence, dreams, and goals. Marriages are broken, innocent children are devastated, and lives are shattered when individuals refusing God's way choose instead to fulfill themselves apart from him. Victory over our flesh and the pull of sin is only possible when we determine moment by moment to abide in an intimate relationship with Christ and walk in the Spirit. This relationship with God does not just happen, but is a continual act of our will, choosing to offer our body, mind, will, and emotions to God. We must admit and acknowledge our own depravity, that we are hopeless and helpless without Him, to depend upon Him with the assurance that He will be faithful to receive and strengthen us. So here's a commentary that I find pretty cool, and I'll share just my points about it, and then you could share maybe something with it too. But the first part of it, it's pretty much just very factual. And this is what we want pastors to see, is that a lot of times we focus just on like facts. Right? And so, hey, sin doesn't always cause physical death, and he goes into it, and he doesn't say anything about him. There's really no him in it. He says lives are shattered. He doesn't say my life is shattered. He doesn't say, nothing about his own personal life. He just says lives are shattered. We do that at the pulpit a lot,
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that kind of, we distance ourselves from the passage. So we'll say lives or your lives or things like that. What do you? We don't use we use you. And so those are ways we distance ourselves from a passage of vulnerability. Because if I'm using we, that means I'm including me.
Right.
But if I'm using you, right, then I'm distancing myself a little bit from it.
Right.
But I like how he does, when he gets to the end, it seems like he comes to this place where he says we. Now he starts using the we.
Yeah.
We must admit and acknowledge our own depravity. So I thought that was a good example of, a place in the a commentary. A lot of us pastors read commentaries where we see, vulnerability, in the writing of the commentator can really help someone who's reading it. So the author helps the reader because he's saying not only what the facts are, but he's also saying the we too. I think he could have went further in that, myself personally. But I don't know, what's your thoughts?
No, I'd like that one as well. The way he expresses it and goes over it, and what that shows is obviously that's a small excerpt from what he's doing, and it's a written commentary, and not necessarily a sermon, and that is a big distinction. I like what you said, that we tend as pastors to like to go through more intellectual ground when we're studying scripture, and you got to remember, the reason why we as pastors are up there teaching in the first place, and not just telling people like, hey, you should read that book, like you should read this commentary because it's really, really great. The reason why we share is not just to download to people an audio version of the commentary that you read, because you're assuming that your flock is too lazy to pick it up on their own. You're doing it because you're adding the human element into it. Right? This is why God relates through man. This is always what he's doing, is he's taking people's stories and he is allowing those stories to proclaim the gospel within it, right? Otherwise, yeah, it would be pretty cool if we all just went into church and all of a sudden a disembodied voice spoke to us from the scriptures and just illustrated things from God's perspective. Would that be very edifying? Yeah. But would it be very hopeful? No.
Yeah, because we could all go into a church and just put on YouTube,
right,
and put it up and go, who's the best teacher we want to listen to today?
And just put it on. And yeah, man, you might leave there thinking like, wow, that was heavy, that was deep. But when you disengage the human element from it, it's no longer a sermon, it's just a lecture. It's just a disconnected lecture from someone who doesn't care about you and doesn't feel the comfortability to relate their story and to help you understand your story through theirs.
Yeah.
That's the importance of it.
And that's a great point. So we hope that becomes like this commentary on James 1:15 becomes like a little bit of a talking point for leadership to get together and discuss that. So we're going to stop there. Thanks for listening.